Hello and welcome back to Algebra 1. Today we are on lesson 12-5, almost to the very end of our book. Alright, today's lesson is methods of solutions. Now before we start, I want you to understand that every one of these problems that are on the board here, we can solve by using the quadratic equation. Okay, and we remember the quadratic equation has this nice little jingle. Negative b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Okay, so as you're writing the quadratic equation, which I'm going to put over here, here it is, negative b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now with this formula, we can actually solve a, b, c, and d. But what this lesson wants to show us is that there's alternative ways to solve for the variable. And that's what we're going to look at today. Okay? We're going to look at the quadratic equation way of solving a problem. We're going to look at property of square roots, factoring, and also completing the squares. And all of these we have already covered before in other lessons. So let's go ahead and start with my favorite, probably your favorite, the quadratic equation. Okay? How does that song go again? Negative b, plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now that brings me to the question. We remember that the very first numeric value in front of the x squared is called my a value. This one is going to be my b value, and 7 is going to be my c value. Okay, so we're going to come on over here, and we're going to go ahead and write this. Now, when you get your a, b, and c, the sign, you see the sign here is a negative. It has to go with the number. Okay, if there's a sign in front of your number, you always have to bring it with you. So in this case, my negative b is going to be negative 12. So negative 12 is positive 12 plus or minus. Now we're looking at the square root of b squared. Okay, b squared is negative 12 squared is going to be 144. Okay, minus 4 times what's my a? 4. And what's my c? 4 a
7.
c, 7. Okay, so let's see what we got. Over 2a, which is 2 times 4 is 8. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and erase this one right here, and we're going to finish this problem. Okay, so 16 times 7. We have to figure out what 16 times 7. 6 times 7 is 42.
112.
So it's 112. So we're going to have, this is going to be 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 minus 12, which is going to be 2.
112.
What?
Minus 112.
112, which is 2, and this is going to be 32. So it's going to be the square root of 32 over 8. Now some of us could say, hey, that's great, we're done, we're looking good. Well, we sort of are and we sort of aren't. Can the square root of 32 be broken down to any squares? Can it? 16 times 2. So instead of writing the square root of 32, I can write this. 12 plus or minus the square root of 16 times the square root of 2 over 8. Okay, everybody should know that the square root of 16 is 4. And I'm going to have 12 plus or minus 4 times the square root of 2 over 8. Almost done. But remember, we always have to reduce. We have to reduce things to its simplest form. And in this case, we can go ahead and reduce all of these by 4. So 4 goes into 12 3 times. Okay, and the 4 is going to turn into a 1, so we're just going to have square root of 2. Okay, and 4 goes into 8. So the answer to this is going to be 3 plus or minus the square root of 2 over 2. And that's using the quadratic equation. All right, now let's look at A, property of square roots. Okay? Like I said, we could still use A in the quadratic equation, except our B here is missing, and that would be a 0. Okay? So if we're missing something, it's going to turn into a 0, and we could still use this formula. But let's try something different. Okay, if you remember the property of squares, it says this, that if you had x squared equals to k, okay, and you want to find out what x is, you take the square root of this side, plus or minus the square root of this side, and that's going to give you your x equals whatever this is, whatever your square root of k is. Now naturally, this k cannot be a negative number. If it is, then there's no solution. Okay, you cannot have a square root of a negative number.
Do I factor out my 12 first?
Well, we can. We can factor out our 12 first. Okay, let's, that's normally how this is done. Now, here's how this is done. In this case, we're going to write 12x squared here, and we're going to send this other guy on the other side, and he's going to be 108. Okay? Now, we want to have our x squared by itself, right? So what we have to do is we have to divide both sides by 12. So if I divide this side by 12 and this side by 12, I get x squared here, and I get 9 over here. Okay, now this looks very familiar to the property of square roots. All I have to do is take the square root of this guy, plus or minus the square root of this guy, and I get x equals plus or minus 3, and that's my answer. My x value will equal plus or minus 3. This is just another way of solving for our variables, and that's called the property of square roots. Now, probably one of the easiest ways of solving problems is by factoring, but a lot of times you can't factor, so you have to be pretty understanding of the times you can factor and the times you can't factor. For example, if I look at this problem, I'd say, well, you know what? I can factor out a number and a variable. I can factor out a 4 and a t, and I would use what we call greatest common factoring. So I'm going to factor out a 4 here and a t, and that's going to leave me with t minus
14.
Oops, before I got the minus sign.
No.
Equals 0.
No,
Now-
not the minus sign.
What?
You're factoring it out. There's no minus sign in the front.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we
So
go.
in this case, either this t or this t has to cause the equation to equal 0 so that we will get a 0 here. The only way that 4 times something will be 0 if it's t, if this t here equals 0. So the answer for this guy, if t is 0, 4 times, the only thing that will make it 0 is 4 times 0. Now let's look over here. All right, well, if I want to make this guy, this whole thing 0, well, I can go set it to 0, and I can say this. T minus 14 equals 0. I add 14 to this side, 14 to this side, and I find out that t equals 14. Which makes sense because if I put a 14 up here, 14 minus 14 is 0. So we've solved for t by factoring. Okay, and then the last method that we can use, we call completing the square. Okay, again, we could use the quadratic equation, but let's just say we decide that we're tired of using that. Let's just go ahead and complete the square. In completing the square is we're going to want these two terms, this term, and we're going to fill in a term so that it's a perfect square. All right, so let's look at this. We're going to start here with n squared minus 8n okay, plus, we don't know, we're going to have to figure out something, put it in here, equals 2. Okay, now what kind of rules do we have to make a perfect square? Well, we look at the middle value. What's the middle value? 8. Okay, we take half of 8, which is 4, and we square it. 4 squared is 16. So what I'm going to do basically is add 16 to each side of my equation. I add 16 here, and I add 16 here. Let's go over this one more time. To get a perfect square, you look at this guy in the middle, and you divide him by 2. In this case, he's 4. When you get the answer, then you square it, and that's where we got our 16. Now what's going to happen is, this side of the equation is going to be a perfect square. Okay, well, what's our perfect square going to be? If we went ahead and factored this, we would find out that our perfect square would be n minus 4 times n minus 4, which would be n minus 4 squared, and we would have 18 over here. Okay, now this sort of looks familiar. Sort of looks like the property of square roots. We've got a square root here. So to free us of this exponent, we take the square root of this guy, and we take the square root of this guy, and this guy's going to turn out to be n minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 18. Now the square root of 18 has a different name. The square root of 18 can also be written as the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, or 3 times the square root of 2. So I'm going to use its simplified name, 3 times the square root of 2. Okay, so we're going to rewrite it as n minus 4 equals plus or minus 3 times the square root of 2. Now I'm going to add 4 to both sides, and my answer for n is going to be n equals 4 plus or minus 3 times the square root of 2. Okay, and then this method is called completing the square. And as I said before, lesson 12-5 just wants you to be informed, wants you to know that there's more ways to skin a cat. Okay?